Have you ever wondered what you would do if the fate of your kingdom, your family, and even your faith depended on a single decision? Imagine everything you know hanging by a thread, and it's up to you to decide whether to face your fears head-on or surrender to the darkness. Sounds like something out of a movie, right? But what if I told you this actually happened? Today, I'm going to share a story that seems unbelievable, but changed the fate of an entire kingdom. Ready? This prince, named Marcus, had an insatiable thirst for power. He didn't just want to rule the kingdom. He wanted to be remembered as the sole sovereign, with no heirs to challenge his authority. Over the years, Marcus slowly distanced himself from the king's council and surrounded himself with allies who shared his twisted vision. With seductive words, he began sowing discord, promising wealth and glory to those who would help him seize the throne. Little by little, Marcus devised a cruel plan. His hunger for power was so intense that he began to see his own family as enemies. To him, the throne was a prize that had to be taken at any cost, even if it meant betraying those who shared his blood. On a cold and silent night, Marcus put his plan into action. With the support of his allies, he initiated a series of silent assassinations, eliminating everyone who stood in his way to the throne. There was no compassion, no remorse. Even his young, innocent nephews were taken from their beds that fateful night. All that mattered was power, and Marcus was determined to have it. But, as often happens, fate had its own way of intervening. Although Marcus managed to eliminate nearly all the heirs to the throne, one child, the youngest of his nephews, was secretly saved by a loyal servant. She hid the boy deep within the castle, where no one would dare search for him. The young heir grew up in secret, unaware of the royal blood that ran through his veins. As Marcus ruled the kingdom with an iron fist, resentment and distrust began to grow. The people, once loyal, started whispering about the king's crimes. They spoke of a betrayal so deep that even the heavens seemed ready to turn against the usurper. Years passed, and the young heir, now grown and strong, was finally revealed. In a daring move, the former king's allies organized a revolt. The kingdom, weary of Marcus's tyranny, rallied around the true heir. When the young prince appeared before the people, it was as if a new hope had been born. Marcus's fall was swift and merciless. The man who had once sacrificed everything for power now found himself without allies, without family, without a kingdom. In his frantic quest for domination, he had destroyed everything of value, including himself. In the end, Marcus learned the hard way that the price of unchecked ambition is absolute loneliness. He, who once dreamed of being the sole ruler, ended his days as a forgotten shadow in history, an example of what happens when power is placed above all else. And so, the kingdom was restored, not just with a new ruler, but with newfound wisdom, that true power lies not in taking, but in serving. And the young king, who had survived betrayal, ruled with justice, always remembering that greed destroys, while virtue builds. But what many didn't know was what happened during those dark years, when Marcus reigned with cruelty. The young prince, hidden in the shadows of the castle, grew up in secret. Under the care of the loyal servant and a few allies who risked their lives, he learned not just about his legacy, but also the true nature of power. The prince's hiding place was no place of comfort. It was a small chamber buried deep within the castle, far from anyone's sight. There, he lived like a ghost, hearing the distant echoes of Marcus's banquets and celebrations while the kingdom crumbled outside. But rather than succumb to despair, the young prince found strength in the darkness. He knew his time would come. During those years, he became a legend. Whispers of the hidden prince began to spread throughout the kingdom. Some said he was already dead, while others believed he would return to claim what was rightfully his. And those rumors, however faint, kept the flame of hope alive. As Marcus ruled with an iron hand, surrounded by betrayal and fear, the hidden prince was being prepared for the future. Those who protected him taught him not only how to lead, but also what it meant to be a fair and compassionate king. He learned that power that doesn't serve the people is a curse, and that true kingship requires sacrifices, not to satisfy personal ambition, but to ensure the well-being of all. And then, in the 7th year of Marcus's reign, When the kingdom was on the brink of collapse, the time came. On a stormy night, the allies still loyal to the true royal lineage gathered in secret. With the support of faithful warriors and the courage of those who remained loyal to the memory of the old king, they took the castle by surprise. The hidden prince was brought into the light, revealed to the people as the rightful heir to the throne. When the young prince appeared before the crowd, wearing the insignia of his lineage, something extraordinary happened. The kingdom, which had bowed to fear and tyranny for so long, rose with him. The people, tired of living under Marcus's cruel rule, saw in the young prince the promise of a new dawn. And so, with determination and courage, the people united to overthrow the usurper. Marcus, the man who once believed he could rule forever, was captured and brought to justice. His end was as swift as his reign had been long. The prince, now crowned king, took the throne that had always been his, not just by right of blood, but by merit of his courage and wisdom. But the dark truth behind this restoration was never fully revealed to the people. Few knew the depth of the betrayal that surrounded Marcus's rise to power, and just how deeply the royal bloodline was involved in his downfall. The young king, now on the throne, knew very well that he hadn't gotten there on his own. Among those who helped him reclaim his place were figures who had once been close members of his own family, the same people who had supported Marcus in the beginning, driven by fear or greed. The betrayal didn't just come from enemies. It also came from within the walls that should have been his protection. Those relatives who had once stood by Marcus betrayed him just as they had betrayed the young king. When they realized Marcus's power was crumbling and that the hidden prince might return, they began to shift their allegiances. Some, who had once been loyal to the usurper, secretly conspired to ensure they ended up on the winning side, no matter who held the throne. And that's what made the young king's victory so bitter. He knew that around him were those who, at the first opportunity, had switched sides to ensure their own survival. They smiled in public, bowed before the new king, but deep down, their loyalty was as fleeting as the tides that shaped the kingdom's fate. Though triumphant, the young king carried the weight of that betrayal. He saw in his relatives' eyes the reflection of Marcus, not the cruel tyrant everyone knew, but the manipulative man who knew how to play on others' fears and ambitions. It was as if Marcus's spirit still lingered, not in a body, but in the court's intrigue. And so, the young king had to learn to rule not only with wisdom but with constant vigilance. He knew that the same people who helped him take the throne could one day try to take it away if circumstances changed. Betrayal was everywhere, and the greatest challenge of his reign would not be defeating external enemies, but maintaining trust in a court where alliances were as fragile as empty promises. Among the familiar faces surrounding the young king, there was one unsettling truth. Despite all the betrayals and conspiracies, a single act of courage had ensured his survival. During the years of darkness, while Marcus consolidated his power and the kingdom trembled under his tyranny, the fate of the throne rested on the shoulders of a simple servant. She was a quiet figure, moving through the castle's shadows, invisible to the powerful. Few knew her name, but those who did called her Lydia. It was Lydia who, on a night of terror, decided to hide the prince, knowing full well that it could cost her life. She had no blood ties to the young heir, nor did she expect any rewards. What drove her was an unshakable faith in the promise that evil should never triumph over good. For the 7 long years that the prince was hidden, Lydia was his shield. She cared for him as if he were her own son, keeping him safe from curious eyes and suspicion. Even when Marcus's soldiers scoured the castle, searching for any threat to the throne, she never wavered. Lydia was a master of deception, maintaining the facade of an ordinary servant while secretly guarding the kingdom's future. She knew that if she were discovered, her death would be certain, but that never stopped her from carrying on. Every day, Lydia taught the young prince not just how to survive, but also how to be patient, how to wait for the right moment to act. And most importantly, she taught him that true power wasn't about striking back immediately, but about silently preparing for the day when justice would finally prevail. Lydia wasn't a warrior, nor a strategist, but her quiet courage and fierce determination were critical to the prince's return to the throne. Without her, he would have been just another name on Marcus's long list of executions. And though her name would never be recorded in the royal annals, the legend of Lydia grew in the hearts of those who knew the true story. The young king, now on the throne, never forgot his debt to her. He knew that without Lydia, the kingdom's restoration would never have been possible. In a gesture of deep gratitude, he invited her to live in the castle, far from the shadows she had inhabited for so many years. But Lydia, with the same humility that had guided her all her life, declined the offer. She preferred to remain on the sidelines, quietly watching the reign she had helped to save, content in knowing she had fulfilled her role. To her, there was no need for titles or riches. Her reward was in the smile of the young king, now safe on the throne, and in the knowledge that the kingdom, once lost to darkness, had once again found the light. As the kingdom stabilized under the reign of the young king, a new shadow began to emerge, this time from an unexpected place: the temple. During his tyrannical rule, Marcus had cultivated more than just fear and oppression. He had harbored a silent hatred for the faith that sustained the kingdom. In his thirst for revenge against everything that represented the old order, he had defiled the sacred temples and, more dangerously, allowed the worship of dark gods in hopes of weakening the divine influence over the people. Marcus didn't just seek power over the kingdom. He turned against the gods that his people had worshipped for generations. He built dark altars, brought in priests from foreign cults, and filled the temple with symbols of his rebellion against the divine. To him, the very existence of a higher power was a threat to his absolute rule. So he tried to destroy what he couldn't control. Now, with the young king on the throne, the scars of that dark time were still visible. The temple, once a symbol of peace and communion between the kingdom and the divine, was stained with the remnants of Marcus's desecration. Altars dedicated to dark gods still lingered, hidden in secret chambers. The echoes of the old profane ceremonies seemed to resonate through the sacred halls. The young king knew that the restoration of the kingdom wouldn't be complete until the temple was purified as well. But this task wouldn't be easy. The worship of these dark gods had rooted fear and mistrust in many hearts, and even after Marcus's downfall, he still had hidden followers who kept these practices alive. The king realized that he would need more than just strength to restore the temple. He would need faith, and not just his own. He called upon the old priests, those who had been banished or forced into hiding during Marcus's reign, and asked them to lead the temple's purification. They were the only ones who knew the ancient prayers and rituals necessary to drive out the darkness that had taken hold. And it was during this process that the young king's true challenge revealed itself. It wasn't just the altars that needed to be destroyed, but the invisible chains of fear and despair that still bound the people to the dark past. The king realized that to truly restore the light in the temple, he would have to confront not just the memories of Marcus's rituals, but the pain those practices had caused in the heart of the kingdom. Slowly, day by day, the priests began to purify the temple. Each altar destroyed, each sacred chant echoed, brought a bit more peace to the kingdom. But the real purification only happened when the people, once too afraid to invoke the wrath of the dark gods, began returning to the temple. They came with offerings, prayers, and, most importantly, hope that the kingdom was finally healing. The young king, watching closely, knew that this was the last remnant of Marcus's reign that needed to be erased. By restoring the temple, he wasn't just purifying a sacred place. He was restoring the soul of the kingdom. And so, the people, once ruled by fear and hatred, began to see that Marcus's power wasn't just a physical wound, but a spiritual one. With the temple purified, the kingdom could finally move forward, free from the shadows that had haunted it for so long. As the young king restored peace and faith in the kingdom, a new challenge arose in his mind. The evil that Marcus had sown during his reign wasn't just in the actions of his followers or the scars left on the temple. There was something deeper, something that poisoned the heart of the kingdom: the false gods. During Marcus's reign, the old altars to dark gods were more than just physical structures. They were symbols of a malignant influence that had infiltrated every corner of the kingdom. The worship of these corrupt gods had spread like a disease. In his attempt to eradicate the faith of their ancestors, Marcus had introduced a new form of idolatry. He brought in foreign priests who offered empty promises of power and wealth in exchange for worship and cruel sacrifices. These gods, known for their bloody rituals and brutal demands, gained a foothold in desperate hearts. The people, oppressed by fear and hunger, turned to these false gods, believing they could bring the salvation that the young king, then just a boy in hiding, could not. And so, the cults of dark gods flourished in secret caves and the most distant villages of the kingdom. Now, as king, he knew that it wasn't enough to restore the main temple and tear down the visible altars. He needed to uproot the spiritual corruption that had taken root in the hearts of his people. The false gods still had their followers, and many still feared abandoning the old practices completely, believing these vengeful deities would punish them if neglected. The young king gathered his advisors and the kingdom's wisest priests. They crafted a plan not just of force but of persuasion. The king knew that simply destroying the altars and persecuting the worshippers of these gods could spark a revolt. The people needed to be guided back to true faith, not forced. So, he began to travel throughout the kingdom, visiting the most remote villages, speaking with the elders, and listening to the people's concerns. He patiently explained that the dark gods held no real power, that the promises of Marcus and his foreign priests were lies. He didn't preach only destruction, but renewal. He invited the people to join in the kingdom's restoration, to abandon the cruel rituals, and return to the true faith that had sustained their ancestors. Gradually, the tide began to turn. The people, seeing the young king's sincerity and determination, began to move away from the false gods. Instead of fear, they began to feel hope again. They saw in the young king not just a ruler, but a spiritual leader guiding them back to the light. The dark altars were destroyed, but more importantly, the hearts that had once been consumed by fear and superstition were set free. Marcus's priests fled or were captured, and the dark gods, who had held the people in spiritual captivity for so long, were forgotten. In time, the kingdom became a place of peace and devotion once more, where the shadows of false gods could no longer penetrate. And the young king, with humility and wisdom, knew that this was the true victory. Not just the restoration of the throne or the temple, but the liberation of his people's hearts from the fear and darkness that had poisoned their souls. The kingdom was finally free, and the young king knew that he had fulfilled his role, not just as a ruler, but as the guardian of his people's faith. But even with the faith restored and the false gods driven away, there was one last challenge the young king needed to face to complete his journey: restoring the true heir to the throne of David. Though the people were at peace and the kingdom was healing, a shadow still loomed over everything. The royal bloodline had almost been wiped out by Marcus's cruelty, and the young king knew that no matter how just his reign was, it wouldn't be complete until the throne was secured in the hands of the promised lineage. During the years of chaos, many records and traditions had been lost. The line of succession had been broken, and even with the young prince on the throne, his family's legacy needed to be restored. It was more than just a matter of blood. It was a matter of divine promise, of destiny. The king knew that to seal his victory, he needed to ensure that the line of David continued, as foretold in the ancient prophecies. The young king returned to the temple, now purified and restored, and summoned the kingdom's wise men and priests. Together, they combed through old records, forgotten texts, and stories passed down through generations. The task was monumental: finding the missing link, the connection that would ensure the throne remained in the hands of the true line of David. After months of searching, a surprising discovery came to light. A distant descendant of the ancient royal lineage, long forgotten, had survived the chaos. He was a humble man, a shepherd who lived in the mountains, unaware of his heritage. When the king's messengers found him, he was incredulous to hear that royal blood ran through his veins. He had never imagined that his simple life hid such a great legacy. The king brought him to the castle, where the shepherd, still stunned by the revelation, was received with honor. The young king knew that his own reign wouldn't be complete until this rightful heir was by his side. But instead of feeling threatened by this new figure, the king felt a deep sense of gratitude. He knew it was his duty to ensure the continuity of the lineage, and that his reign was just one part of a greater plan. The shepherd, reluctant at first, accepted his inheritance not as a burden, but as a mission. He was trained and prepared to one day take the throne, not as a conqueror, but as a guardian of the promise made to David. And so, the kingdom was secured for future generations. The young king, seeing the rightful heir by his side, knew he had fulfilled the greater purpose. The throne of David, nearly destroyed by chaos and ambition, was secure once again, and the kingdom, now restored, was ready to prosper under the protection of the divine promise. And so, the young king continued to rule with wisdom, knowing that when the time came, he could pass the crown to the one destined to continue the legacy. The kingdom was finally complete, and the cycle of betrayal, darkness, and fear was broken, replaced by hope, faith, and a future secured in the promised lineage. But even with the kingdom restored and the royal lineage secured, the young king knew that the peace won through so much sacrifice needed to be preserved. And this peace wouldn't be maintained by royal blood or military strength alone. It depended on constant vigilance against the evil that, even when defeated, still lurked in the shadows, seeking new ways to corrupt the heart of the kingdom. It was then that a crucial figure emerged from the shadows, the priest who had guided the young king since his hidden childhood, the man who had risked everything to keep the flame of the true lineage alive. This priest, whose name was now known and respected throughout the kingdom, understood that the work was not yet finished. He was a man of faith, but also of action, and he knew that the kingdom's enemies would not rest. This priest, named Elias, became the silent protector of the throne. He didn't seek glory or recognition, but worked tirelessly to ensure that the kingdom wouldn't fall back into darkness. Elias knew that even though the temple was restored and the line of David was secure, the scars left by Marcus and the false gods still lingered, hidden deep within the hearts of some. Elias began forming a network of watchmen and protectors. He chose men and women of faith, discreet individuals who understood the true nature of the evil that had once tried to dominate the kingdom. They weren't warriors with swords, but guardians of the faith, dedicated to protecting the kingdom from within. Elias trained them to detect the signs of corruption, to sense when darkness attempted to infiltrate once again, whether through old cults, political conspiracies, or simply the greed that still lingered in the shadows. While the young king ruled, Elias and his watchmen kept the kingdom safe from invisible threats. They dismantled cults that tried to resurface, stopped conspiracies before they could gain momentum, and most importantly, strengthened the faith of the people, constantly reminding them of the lessons learned during Marcus's dark years. To Elias, the kingdom's power wasn't just in the crown, but in the spiritual strength of its people. As the years passed, the young king, now older and wiser, watched Elias's work with gratitude. He knew that without the priest and his watchmen, the hard-won peace could easily crumble. Elias had not only protected the throne during the dark times, but continued to guard the soul of the kingdom, ensuring that evil would never find a home there again. And so, the kingdom flourished, not just through the king's wisdom, but through the tireless vigilance of Elias and his guardians. They were the eyes and ears of the throne, always watchful, always ready to act when needed. Peace wasn't just the absence of war, it was a state of mind, a delicate balance maintained by those who understood that the true battle was fought in the hearts of the people. And thanks to Elias, the kingdom was prepared to face whatever challenges the future might bring, protected by an invisible but powerful force that would never allow darkness to reign again. But even with the kingdom at peace and protected by Elias and his watchful guardians, the young king believed he could finally rule without the shadow of the past. However, an ancient prophecy began to echo among the elders of the kingdom, a prophecy that spoke not of the return of a tyrant, but of a forgotten descendant, someone destined to fulfill a divine purpose in a way neither the king nor Elias could foresee. This prophecy foretold that, at the most unexpected moment, when the kingdom was at the height of its prosperity, a lost heir of the ancient line of David would emerge to fulfill a promise made generations ago. This heir, though unknown, would bring with him a power that even the young king did not possess, something beyond royal blood or political wisdom. He would carry God's blessing to renew the kingdom from within, like a light igniting in the darkness. When the young king heard of this prophecy, he felt a mix of curiosity and unease. He knew that his reign had been guided by many unseen hands and that, while he had restored the kingdom in many ways, there were still forces beyond his control. The fate of the kingdom, it seemed, wasn't entirely in his hands. Then, one day, during one of the many religious ceremonies at the temple, an unusual visitor appeared. He was a simple man, a traveler who did not draw attention at first glance. However, when he entered the temple, something changed in the atmosphere. Elias, always attuned to any sign of danger or blessing, felt this man's presence as something different, something beyond human power. The traveler, whose name was Samir, approached the altar and, upon touching the sacred ground, began to pray in silence. But his prayers were more than mere words. They seemed to invoke an ancient force, a promise that had been forgotten but never broken. Elias watched from a distance, without interfering, knowing that this was the moment the prophecy was being fulfilled. Samir, though unknown to the people, revealed himself as the lost heir of the ancient lineage, the one who carried the spiritual legacy of David. He did not claim the throne, nor did he seek earthly power. Instead, he came to remind the kingdom that its true power did not lie in the crown or the sword, but in the faith that sustained the covenant between God and the people. He began to speak with the young king, not as a challenger, but as a spiritual guide. Samir explained that his arrival was not to take the throne, but to ensure that the kingdom remained faithful to the promises made to David. He came to ignite the lamp mentioned in the prophecy, a spiritual flame that would ensure the kingdom would never again be swallowed by darkness. The young king, listening to these words, understood the depth of what was happening. He realized that despite all his victories and accomplishments, there was something greater at play, a divine purpose that went beyond his own understanding. Samir, with his humble yet powerful presence, brought a spiritual renewal to the kingdom, something that even Elias, with all his vigilance, could not have anticipated. With Samir's arrival, the kingdom entered a new era. The people's faith was renewed in a way that transcended rituals and traditions. Now, there was a true connection with the divine, a flame burning in the heart of each person, reminding them of God's eternal promise to the lineage of David. And so, the young king, guided by Samir and protected by Elias, continued to rule, not just as a worldly king, but as a guardian of a light that could never be extinguished. The kingdom was finally complete, not just in power or prosperity, but in spirit and faith, ready to face whatever the future might bring, knowing that God's promise would never fail. With Samir bringing spiritual renewal to the kingdom and the young king ruling with wisdom, it seemed that everything was finally in balance. However, one last challenge loomed, a challenge that didn't come from external forces or hidden conspiracies, but from within the hearts of the people. For even with faith renewed and the spiritual flame burning bright, the true test of God's promise was yet to come, the challenge of time. As the years passed, the kingdom flourished. But as happens in all prosperous realms, the memory of hardship began to fade. Prosperity brought with it the temptation of comfort and complacency. The old rituals were still performed, and faith was still professed, but quietly, something was changing in the hearts of the people. The spiritual spark that Samir had ignited, though still glowing, was beginning to weaken under the weight of daily routines and the illusion of security. And it was at this moment that the true test emerged. A terrible drought began to devastate the kingdom, something that hadn't happened since the days of Marcus. The crops failed, the rivers began to dry up, and the people, who hadn't faced a crisis of this magnitude in a long time, began to panic. Some whispered that the old gods were returning, vengeful for having been abandoned. Others, more pragmatic, blamed the king for not doing enough to protect the kingdom. The young king, now older and wiser, felt the weight of the people's growing despair. He knew this drought was not just a natural phenomenon, it was a test. The divine promise, the lamp that Samir had lit, was being challenged, not by an external enemy, but by internal doubt. It was then that Samir, silent since his arrival years earlier, emerged once again. He stood before the king and the priests, and with a firm voice, reminded them that God's promise didn't depend on circumstances but on the people's faith. The drought is not a curse, he said, but a a test to see if the flame God lit in our hearts can still shine, even when all other lights go out. Samir called the people to the temple, not for a sacrificial ritual or a desperate plea to the heavens, but for an act of pure faith. He asked everyone, rich and poor, young and old, to gather in the heart of the kingdom, not to pray for rain, but to reaffirm their trust in God, regardless of the outcome. And so, on a night when the stars were hidden behind heavy clouds, the people gathered in silence. There were no songs, no prayers, just a deep and powerful silence, filled with quiet faith. The young king stood among them, alongside Ilyas and Samir, all holding hands, not as leaders, but as equals, trusting in the greater plan that, even in adversity, had never abandoned them. For hours, the people waited. The drought didn't end immediately. The clouds didn't bring rain that night, but something changed. The faith that had begun to waver was reborn in the hearts of the people. They understood that God's true promise wasn't in visible blessings, but in the invisible strength of their trust in Him, even in difficult times. In the days that followed, the rain finally came, and the drought began to subside. But what truly remained was the lesson learned on that silent night, that God's true promise, the lamp that had been lit in David's lineage, would never be extinguished as long as the people kept their faith, even in the darkest moments. And so, the kingdom carried on, strengthened not just by its prosperity, but by a faith that transcended circumstance. The young king, Samir, and Ilyas knew they had fulfilled their roles. The future was secure, not just in the hands of men, but in the hands of God, whose promise never fails.